can see this presentation now.
Okay, you've got it. So the paper is very straightforward. It's called Cephalometrics, a Perspective. Sometimes it's also known as Cephalometrics in Perspective. It was published in the Angle Orthodontist in 1972, so it's an old paper. And it is worthwhile looking at some of these old papers because you see orthodontics repeat itself. We go around in cycles, and we can learn from looking at the old papers because they actually give us an insight really into the cycles that we're in within orthodontics. So let's talk a little bit about this guy, Ernest Hixon. He was incredibly well known at the time. He was the professor and chair of orthodontics at Oregon, and then he became the dean of the dental school at Otago in New Zealand. And he very tragically died in a car accident in Buenos Aires in Argentina when he was aged 50. So it was a massive loss to, I think, academic orthodontics. His writing was very interesting. He often would try and place orthodontics within the current culture of the time to try and sort of give a perspective, which I think is something that perhaps we should all be starting to think about a little more nowadays. So this paper was published in 1972. It was based on an address that he did to the Angle Society in late 1971. So it reads very much like a speech or a presentation. So what was going on in 1972? What was in the world at that point? Because I guess many people listening or watching today won't even have been born in 1972.
Well, first of all, I read the paper and they said the population was 3.5 or 3.2 billion. And now we explode. We are 7.
Yeah, so it's a massive difference. So in 1972, I was 15 years old. This is a bit UK-centric. The troubles in Northern Ireland were at their height. It was a tremendously uncertain time in the UK. It was also a time of massive social revolution within the United Kingdom as well, with the miners' strike and the era of Thatcherism leading through to years of right-wing government in the UK and also in the USA, and I think across the majority of the world. It was the first performance of Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, which means something to me, and David Bowie released Ziggy Stardust. It was also the year of Watergate, tremendous upheaval within the United States. So this was not a settled time across the world. The first handheld calculator was made and sold for $395. Now, I'm not sure what that would be worth now in terms of monetary value, but I would probably say it's $1,500, £1,500, 1,500 euros, 1,500 whatever. But that was the first handheld calculator, which would have absolutely no power at all.
And did you notice that he actually defined what's computer? When he mentioned computer in the paper, he put between 2 brackets, what the computer mean? For the
I mean, there were no, I didn't know, I hadn't got a calculator when I was doing my exams when I was 15. So, what else was happening? In orthodontics, the USA was leading the world in fixed appliances and research. Everybody was influenced by the United States and their academics and the clinical work that was being done because they were ahead of everybody. Cephalometrics was very widely used, and this is very relevant to Hixon's paper, is that growth prediction was being promoted very heavily by companies who would volunteer, well, they wouldn't volunteer because you'd have to pay them, by companies who were offering to do growth prediction using the newly invented computers. But cephalometrics was a very widely used part of orthodontic treatment. The extractions were common. They were definitely in the extraction phase of treatment. And within the USA, headgear was very common as well, with that hope of modifying growth. Within Europe and the sort of the European countries, functional appliances were being developed and used in Europe. The most popular ones at that point were probably the Frankel and the Bionator and those sort of appliances. So when you look at the orthodontic world at that point in the countries that were perhaps providing more orthodontic treatment than others, there was a general sort of feeling that headgear and fixed appliances were being used in the American countries, and then Europe and through to the East, we were more using functional appliances, removable appliances, and things such as that. Most common fixed appliances were sort of standard edgewise with non-torqued brackets, and the beg technique was still being followed, though it was starting to lose its popularity in Australia and the East. So that's our sort of overall background as to what orthodontics was up to at that point. I can probably safely say there was minimal orthodontic research in terms of outcomes and treatment effects and things such as that. People were using cephalometrics to look at facial growth, and they were looking at cephalometrics to look at treatment effect. But in terms of thinking about trials or those forms of research, pretty much nothing was being done at that point. So orthodontics in many ways was being driven by personal opinion and case report. So let's have a look at his paper. It was called Cephalometrics, a Perspective. And when you look at the level of evidence, it's probably safe to say this was straightforward personal opinion, but it was a very interesting personal opinion. So I'm going to come out of that one now and then go into my PDF.
Even I was looking at the participant, I thought 337. I thought, well, only 337. Then I actually, the number one is overlapping. So we almost 1,400.
Yes, which is a little worrying at this point. Bearing in mind,
you should be careful of what you are going to say about cephalometric, okay?
I've never been careful about what I'm going to say. So here we go. So I'm going to do this in the way that I've done it before. So I'm on an iPad, so if I keep looking down, don't worry. So first of all, the start of his paper is pretty much the best start I've ever seen in an orthodontic paper. I'm just going to look and see what he says here. Hang on. Which is fairly straightforward. If I could sit on the moon and look down at the Earth in a small planet in a third-rate solar system, what has cephalometrics contributed? His point being is what use is it? And he felt that what it does is it raised more questions than answers. So he said it has humanized the orthodontist and it has helped to teach him that he doesn't have all the answers. He also points out at this point in his introduction that every scientific study that has been done shows how little we know and that life is very complex. And actually, one thing that he pointed out that cephalometrics does is it allows us to look at the gradual recognition of variation amongst people. So he's leading through to start a discussion, which is really about malocclusion being a normal variation rather than a disease. He puts his viewpoint straight away, and he actually says that the cephalogram is only useful for describing certain tissue relationships at a single point in time. They're actually of no use in predicting facial growth, and he returns to that later. And remember, at this time, people were wanting to try and predict facial growth using cephalometrics. And he felt that the problem that we should be addressing is what he termed as the beast, which was malocclusion. He has quite a subtle viewpoint here when he wanted to look at the viewpoint of malocclusion from hereditary and environment. And you initially start to read this and think, oh, he's going into the old discussion about hereditary and environment in terms of the etiology of malocclusion. But he doesn't, because what he does here, and I thought this was quite a clever way of starting, he's looking at genetics versus orthodontics instead of the environment. And so what he's raising at this point is, can orthodontic treatment overcome the genetic component of malocclusion, which is clearly there? He mentions at this point is that Angle's original concept of orthodontics, which was very important, driving American orthodontic philosophy, was recast. And we'll look at that when we move through to the next page. And he points out that Angle's influence at that point in the United States was still quite enormous, and it probably still has quite an effect on us now. And that when Angle was putting orthodontic treatment together, or actually really philosophizing about orthodontic treatment, we actually didn't know very much as a species. Evolution wasn't too widely held, particularly in the United States. Paleontology didn't exist. And there was very few archaeological theories to actually give him support. But what he did say, and this is where Angle was completely, it's wrong to say he was wrong, but there was a misinterpretation of some of Angle did make some misinterpretations of the concept of growth. And he actually said that man was created perfect and that malocclusions were the result of a faulty environment, and that the ideal alignment of teeth did not reach this concept of full expression. So he felt that something was stopping people growing, and he called this a perverted bone growth. So with this logic, what Angle's mechanics were doing was that they wanted to re-establish normal occlusion, which would stimulate the bone cells and cause nature to develop bone on a large scale. So his thesis was, if you expanded the arches with his type of fixed appliance, that would stimulate the bone to grow, and that would allow us, or allow orthodontists in that point, to correct crowding and any type of anteroposterior malocclusion. Which actually is quite interesting, because that's exactly what Dwight Damon and the Damon aficionados have been saying, which was a concept that was introduced by Angle many, many years ago. So nothing is new. So what happened then was that there was initial aspects of orthodontic treatment were done expanding, because Angle thought that you would stimulate bone. And in the 1940s, as we know, there was a complete discussion. And actually what was happening was Tweed had felt that arch expansion wasn't necessary, and in fact was potentially wrong, leading to relapse. And then the United States went on sort of a switch more through to extraction therapy. At the same time of that, Clone invented the cervical pawl headgear, and that was used to correct class 2 problems by pushing the molars back. So there was this big change at this point. So Hixon developed that quite a lot more, and he really counteracted, I think, Angle's argument. Remember, Angle's argument is about the environment and expansion and bone growing and things like that. And this is a very important paragraph within this paper, which is why I've highlighted it a couple of times. He said that in that light today, so that is in 1972, the orthodontist is treating normal genetic variation. And by treating normal genetic variation, he's there then forcing malocclusion into something that's socially acceptable. And this ideal occlusion is socially normal in the same way that it actually was for some tribes to bind some sort of more primitive tribes to bind the cranium or to file their teeth or tattoo their body. So really this was a cultural shift that was happening, taking a genetic problem, which was malocclusion, and normalizing it into an ideal that was relevant to that society. And that was quite a revolutionary viewpoint at that time. So he goes as far as to say ideal occlusion is a man-made definition. And that's very important. So then he also then moved through to look at the necessity for teeth. And he went on a little bit of a ramble at this point, but it is quite important because he actually was contrasting the treatment of malocclusion to form an ideal occlusion in terms of the person's appearance and their social acceptability, but also pointing out quite clearly that actually we can survive without our teeth. Our teeth aren't important. And there are very few features of malocclusion that actually fall into a functional range so much that we cannot survive. And we know that from looking at our patients. And he actually, there's another nice sentence here, and this paper is full of nice sentences, where he actually says from the standpoint of teeth, or sorry, from the standpoint of digestion, teeth are a convenience to help enjoyment of a good cuisine, but they're not important for our survival. They're also important for speech, but again, not massively important. So he then took us through to this overall concept here of what we are trying to treat. And are we using our cephalometrics to try and treat to normal? But what is normal? And that's quite important. And you look at normal, or what we consider is normal in terms of dentistry and in terms of malocclusion, it can be defined as statistical or average. So that is the most frequent, the usual, the popular. Now, actually, when you look at the epidemiology of teeth and malocclusion, in fact, perfect class 1 is not the normal. And that, I think, is the point that he was making here. The other problem is functional. Does it work? Do people have problems eating? Do they have pain? Is it non-pathological? But then he moved forwards to idealistic, and this is in fact is what we do. The idealistic viewpoint of occlusion is the way that it ought to be. And in terms of orthodontics, he's pointed out, of course, Angle's famous Old Glory, which was a skull that was in his surgery that had a perfect class 1 occlusion. And so, in many ways, there is a treating towards an idealistic occlusion, which is perfect class 1. So, then again, he's going back to Angle's original concept of occlusion and to say that it's static and perfectionist, as opposed to something that's functional, because we can function with any type of malocclusion. So moving on, he was now entering into the extraction and non-extraction discussion that was going on. And he pointed out that if you wanted to follow the original idealistic theories of Angle, which was to expand the dental arches to relieve crowding and release mandibular growth to correct a class 2 relationship, you must expect a high percentage of relapse or rebound, and then you have retainers all the time. You need long-term retention. That's where we are now, I think, where we've moved on that extraction, non-extraction pendulum several times since 1972. But we seem to now be in a phase of non-extraction treatment. And our solution to any consideration about relapse is we will lose long-term retention. So this was highlighted as a concept in a paper written in 1972. So this shows the turning of the orthodontic wheel very nicely. And he is right in this respect, and I think our research is showing us that, is that if you are going to expand and you're not going to extract in some cases, we're not going to magically grow growth, we're not going to magically grow mandibles, then in that respect, we are in a position where we need long-term retention, and that's the price we pay. Mm. He's also pointed out the use of orthopedic forces, which was also becoming very popular in the United States. And importantly, he said here, no one has ever been able to demonstrate scientifically that orthodontic forces or orthopedic forces produce a clinical, meaningful 1 or 2 millimeter permanent effect on the facial bones and their supporting musculature. That's where we are still. We know that with functional appliances, you get about 2 millimeters additional growth, perhaps combined in the maxilla and the mandible. We also know you get about 1.5 millimeters of what is called maxillary restraint, but it's probably, again, normal variation from headgear. In fact, I think one of the most interesting things I've come across since I've been a research orthodontist, that the answer to most orthodontic problems is 1.7. Is 1.7 millimeters is the answer to most things. You get 1.7 millimeters distal movement with TADs. You get 1.7 millimeters additional movement with a functional appliance. The answer is still the same as it was in 1972. We don't grow faces. We don't orthopedically modify the facial skeleton. So moving through to the rest, he got bogged down here, I thought, in talking about his own treatment philosophy. Essentially it was, and it is outlined here in this top left-hand section called slum, is how they planned treatment in those days. And so he said, and I think this was how I was taught to plan orthodontic treatment, because at that time in the UK, the power of the soft tissue envelope in defining the position of the teeth led a lot of the philosophy, and I think this is reflected here. So he does say, first of all, he looks at the skeletal pattern. If you need more than 1 to 2 millimeters change in the skeletal pattern to produce an ideal treatment, then you need surgery. Now that's quite harsh, because we know there's an envelope of discrepancy that we can work within and produce results that are quite good. And there's always that borderline between surgery and non-surgery, but it's a sensible way to start. Then he's built around the lower arch. If you've got crowding, do you need to extract? And then how do you fit the upper arch to the lower arch? Fairly classic treatment planning, which dominated in those days. And certainly I think it's something that is potentially getting itself a little bit lost, where we get a sort of a one approach treats all. There are orthodontists that just purely treat on and treat non-extraction. There are those who treat purely with functional appliances. We're getting this now with the carrier appliance, which seems to be the answer to every orthodontic problem in the world, is you put these fancy bits of metal on with some elastics, and you convert anybody into anything, and then the treatment's easy and straightforward, faster, better, and less uncomfortable. But this slum concept here is the basis still of traditional orthodontics, and I do sometimes wonder if our sort of cookbook approach to treatment, which has started to develop, is moving us away from the more traditional approach, which we know has worked for many years. And I think this was Hixon's point here. He also starts to talk about the reliability and validity of cephalometrics, and in many ways we understand that. But importantly, he pointed out that when we are trying to predict growth using a cephalogram and are trying to make some measurements, there's so much measurement error that we actually can't really measure the effect of our treatment, because the effect of our treatment are only 1 to 2 millimeters on the skeletal pattern. And he also then, at this bottom right-hand part of this paper, starts to talk about something which was quite interesting. And I remember now reading this when I was a postgraduate student and thinking, that actually is surprisingly sensible. And it is so sensible, I don't understand why we seem to have forgotten it, certainly when we're trying to predict growth. So he pointed out here that when we see our patients in adolescence, most facial dimensions are at least 85% of their adult size. So they've not got much growth to go. Most of our patients have about 15% of their facial growth to go by the time we see them, if we're seeing them traditionally and when they are young adolescents. So he pointed out 17 millimeters of growth for the mandible occurs with a standard deviation of 3.8. So he pointed out, so if you use age 12 as an example, you don't need a computer to add 17 millimeters to the mandibular length, because that's what you're going to get in terms of an overall average. So in terms of facial growth prediction, if you take the concept that you want to try and predict that, and that's what they were trying to do in those days, you can't really predict the way that someone's going to grow if they were aged 8 or 9, because of the effect of genetics, and that you could look at their parents, he pointed out. But also if they're 12 or 13, they're nearly grown anyway. You've only got 15% of their growth. So it's easy to predict their facial growth, because it's going to be the same as you're looking at in the chair at that moment. So he's actually said, and he gets quite rude about cephalometrics down to the bottom, he actually starts saying that really what you're doing is measuring bumps on an X-ray, and you're trying to predict, and you actually can't do it. So he dismissed craniofacial growth prediction from cephalograms in a very straightforward way. His final paragraphs really, he was trying to sum up, and he really said that his prediction for the future of cephalometrics is that we will try and use cephalometrics for predictive purposes for another generation or so, in the name of security, motherhood, and the archangels. And he was right, because cephalometric prediction, I think, slowly started to die out in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And actually that overall concept of trying to predict the way that people were going to grow from taking serial cephalograms has pretty much gone now. He said for research, it will continue to be used for describing faces and for making long-term comparisons between treatment. Again, screamingly obvious, measurement error is too great for short-term comparisons. And I think he is right again, it's hard to think of a trial that's done nowadays. And I look back at some of the work that we did on the class 2 cases and the class 2 studies. All we simply did was describe what the treatment did in terms of millimeters. But our measurement error was quite large in those papers. And it probably wasn't useful because they were short-term comparisons. They were only looking at a course of treatment over 2 years in some of the functional plant studies. In the early treatment studies, that was looking at treatment over a 10-year period. I think we got more from that because our measurement error, certainly in terms of the overall proportion of the things we were trying to measure, was minimized. So did I waste my time in those projects looking at cephalometrics? Yeah, I think I probably did. I think most of the results of the studies that we did in the middle 1990s, early 2000s on class 2 malocclusion, we used the wrong outcome measures and we probably missed what we were trying to find out. So he stated that cephalometrics is used for comparative purposes, like a photograph to describe where we've been and no more, like a picture on our holidays. It shows where we've been, where we started from, but actually in terms of helping us plan treatment in terms of growth prediction, and again, it's going back to his thesis about growth prediction, it's not terribly useful. But he wraps up by saying here, he rejects it in terms of diagnosis, but he said it's not an excuse for sloppy orthodontics. And he was pointing out, and this is the message that I picked up from him at this point, that actually you still need to treat people well, you still need to treat people to that arbitrary norm, that ideal norm that he had discussed. But you don't treat them to cephalometric numbers. You treat them in terms of looking at the patient's face and looking at the way their soft tissues are and their skeletal pattern, rather than treating to the cephalometric numbers. Because he felt there that we owe it to the patient to respect biological principles which govern the growth of the dentition, and they're not described by a cephalometric analysis. So his overall thesis is that cephalometrics is useful occasionally. It's not used routinely. And it's something that we should consider. Even now, I think, certainly then he said we should be considering it, but now it's something we should think about. So I'm now going to move into really my keynote presentation about what I got from this paper. But I just wanted to point something out which someone pointed out to me here in the references. Is I'm not sure if this is Lyle Johnson's first ever paper. But actually, I don't know how old Niall Johnson would have been. Hang on, there's a wasp in my study. It's a bee, I'm safe. It was sitting on the camera. I'm not sure if this is Lyle Johnson's first paper, but actually to be cited by Hixon is a tremendous achievement. Lyle Johnson said he was going to try and join us today, so I don't know if he is going to wave, but it is very interesting, and I think it's a sort of a statement for Lyle Johnson is you know, it is great to be cited by Hixon in this landmark paper. So I'm now going to move into my PowerPoint presentation, which I really outline what I got from this paper.
Kevin, Hixon said in his paper that he mainly taken to assess the lower incisor position, which
yeah.
And this is very occasional. Like he even said that it could be 4 or 5 cases where the control of lower incisor by some postgraduate student will be lost. So what's your opinion about this comments?
Yeah, I mean, his comment there reflected the times. And remember at that point, there was a lot of belief in the soft tissue envelope and that the soft tissue, quite rightly, and I think that we still believe this now, influences the position of the teeth. So if you'd over-procline the lower incisors on a non-extraction basis, for example, then you're more likely to get relapse. And that, I think, is still what we say now, except what we'll say now is, yeah, we can procline those lower incisors, say, to help in correcting a class 2 incisor relationship or relief of crowding, but actually it doesn't matter because we're going to put bonded retainers on. Whereas I think in the days of Hixon, they didn't have bonded retainers. We have to remember that. Yeah. They had removable retainers. So they were very much looking towards putting the teeth in what they perceived to be the neutral zone, which was really where they started from. We can expand on that later, because if you always left the lower incisors where they were, and you use retraction mechanics, you're going to dish quite a lot of faces in.
True.
I think it's a dilemma I think the orthodontists in those days had, and we have to consider is, are we better off now, or are we just simply putting retainers on and then in 10, 20 years time our patients will relapse? So what did I think about this paper? I've always thought it was great writing. I wish I could write as well as this. It was very thoughtful, it was very perceptive, and he also exhibited quite a dry sense of humour. His overall concept was about genetics versus environment versus orthodontics, and really his argument was, can orthodontics overcome the genetics in terms of facial growth? And the answer there is no, it can't. He also looked at that concept of ideal occlusion and normalizing the occlusion, which was led by Angle. and remembering that a deviation from an ideal occlusion doesn't necessarily mean that someone needs orthodontic treatment. And that ideal occlusion is very much a societal norm, which is become much more normal nowadays than I think it was in the 1970s. Cephalometrics doesn't provide all the answers. I remember when I was a postgraduate student, I used to agonize over my cephalometric tracings when I was trying to plan treatment, thinking, is this, if I do this tracing very carefully, is it going to help me come to a decision on a treatment plan? And of course, most of my treatment plans were invariably wrong in those days. So did it help me do that? Cephalometrics didn't at that point. To me, it just added to the confusion. It only provides information on the lower incisor position. And growth prediction isn't possible. And growth prediction really has been discounted. So therefore, cephalometrics was being extensively used and misused at that time. They still felt that we could modify the skeletal pattern. There are some people who still feel we can do it now, but really they're with the angels if they think they can modify the skeletal pattern. There's no need for overcomplicated cephalometric analysis because we should treat the position of the lower arch. And how have things changed since then? I think things have changed a lot in terms of our overall philosophy. We certainly are providing more non-extraction treatment than we used to. I think we're still being sold the same amount of snake oil that was going around at that point in terms of expansion. Angle's thesis was slowly dying out in the United States with this understanding that you can't grow bone by expanding, but that has come back in again. We know we can't predict. How have things changed? I think we have a greater understanding, but I also think it's very helpful to look back at papers like this, and it helps us understand a little bit more about our current orthodontic systems. And it's always good. I've obviously sat back and read this paper very carefully, and perhaps far more carefully than I have ever done before. But if I was a practicing clinician, it would make me think a little bit more about cephalometrics, my cephalograms, but also about my balance of extraction and non-extraction. A paper that certainly needs writing, though, if we're now thinking where we are now in terms of developments, would be this one, which is CBCT perspective. And it might be worth thinking about that at this point, that maybe someone needs to sit down and do an Ernest Hixon on cone beam rather than cephalograms. And indeed, it's something that it's going to take a fair amount of work to do that carefully. But I think that if we just simply transpose cone beam CT into Hixon's paper, we get a lot of answers here already, or over there already. So that's the sort of the value that I got from this paper. I'll just get rid of